Now we'll see further how Mahatma Ji replies to these contradictions. And I'll share the screen to share my slides with you. Okay, so we have completed. Our last slide was slide number 35, where this question was raised by Senate, point number 1 and 2, which were the contradictions. There was some confusion about the rounds and races. And Hume accused the Mahatmas of building up the philosophies as he has gone about teaching them. And he invented a great many more races. Okay. And the second point, where Senate has some confusion about the state of the victims of accident. What is their after death state? And he was not worried about those rounds and races. So let's see what Mahatma Ji says. He says that nor do they fret me, particularly. The points which did not bother Senate, they also did not bother KH. But as they furnish our mutual friend, that is Hume, with a good handle against us, which he is likely to use any day in that nasty way, so preeminently his own. I rather explain them once more with your kind permission. So these points, which both of them considered superficial, but for the sake of Hume, Mahatma Ji was willing to explain them again. And he says, of course, it is our usual way of getting out of difficulties, having been invented ourselves. We repay the inventors by inventing imaginary races. So he's using a bit of humor. He says there are a good many things more we are charged with having invented. Well. There is one thing at any rate we can never be accused of inventing. And that is Mr. Hume himself. To invent his like transcends the highest siddhi powers we know of. So regarding this inventing, the background is like this, that HPB, she had been accused of inventing the brothers. People did not believe that the Mahatmas actually existed. And they accused HPB that she was simply inventing the brothers. And now these invented brothers, they are being accused of inventing races and rounds. This is what Senate was accusing them of. Then Mahatma Ji uses a very sharp humor, saying that not only the only thing that is not possible for them to invent is the likes of Hume himself, given his nature. It was such. He further says, and now, good friend, before we proceed any further, pray read the appended number A. It is time you should know us as we are, only to prove to you, if not to him, that we have not invented those races. I will give out for your benefit that which has never been given out before. I will explain to you a whole chapter out of Rice David's work on Buddhism, or rather on Lamaism, which in his natural ignorance, he regards as a corruption of Buddhism. So Mahatma Ji wanted Senate to know who the adepts really are, how they work. In the earlier part, they had given that how an adept works. All the time, he doesn't possess his occult powers. Okay, and frequently people have this false impression about their work and power, which gives rise to misconceptions. And he would also explain to Senate Rice David's work on Buddhism, which is basically Lamaism. Lamaism, it is the system of doctrine and observances which the lamas maintain and the practice. Okay, it is basically Tibetan Buddhism. Since those gentlemen, the Orientalists, presume to give to the world their soi-disant translations, that is self-styled translations and commentaries on our sacred books, let the theosophists show the great ignorance of those world pundits by giving the public the right doctrines and explanations of what they would regard as an absurd fancy theory. So we have many people from the West who study the Eastern scriptures. And these Eastern scriptures, they are mostly symbolic. Most of the times they are very cryptic. They contain hidden esoteric meaning. HPB says that to understand the occult philosophy, it requires 7 keys. And the Western people who have studied these Eastern philosophies and scriptures, they often do not grasp the real esoteric meaning behind it. And they formulate their own interpretation, which sometimes results in quite absurd, fancy theories. Actually, if you remember in one of the previous letters, Mahatma M, he quoted about Shiva from the Yoga Shastra. And he says that such is the ideal of Shiva of Yoga Shastra, the culmination of spiritual wisdom. And he goes on to add that, oh, you Max Mullers and Monier Williams, what have you done with our philosophy? Meaning they have quite misinterpreted our philosophy. So it is the great responsibility of the theosophist, here Mahatma Ji is clearly saying, that it is the great responsibility of the theosophist to rid the people of their ignorance by explaining the right doctrines. He has said, Mahatmas have said that if you know, it is your duty to help others to know. That is why it is important that the theosophist show the great ignorance of those world pundits and give the public the right doctrines. Now, the next point raised by Sinnett was that in one of the letters Mahatma Ji mentioned, I can easily understand we are accused of contradictions and inconsistencies. I even too writing one thing today and denying it tomorrow. Could you but know how I write my letters and the time I am enabled to give to them, perchance you would feel less critical if not exacting. So Sinnett says, this passage, it was which led me to think it might be that some of the earlier letters had been perhaps the victim of accident. Because Mahatma Ji is mentioning that he has very little time to write this. So Sinnett is thinking that it might be possible Mahatma Ji wrote one thing today and denied it in another letter because he writes them hurriedly with very little time at his disposal. To this, Mahatma KH has replied, and because I admit the superficial or apparent inconsistencies, and even that in the case only of one who is so thoroughly unacquainted with our doctrines as you are, is that a reason why they should be regarded as conflicting in reality? So he's telling Sinnett that what appears to him as inconsistencies, it is only because he is not at all conversant with their doctrines. This does not mean that they are actual inconsistencies. He gives the example of the moon. What Mahatma Ji says that suppose today he says the moon has no atmosphere. Okay. Then at another time, if he said that the moon has an atmosphere of its own, then definitely a novice student will charge him with saying one thing today and a complete opposite thing tomorrow. But a person who's acquainted with the esoteric doctrine, point Mahatma Ji is mentioning, a Kabbalist who knows that the moon has no atmosphere, answering in any respect to that of our earth, but one of its own, entirely different from that your men of science would call one. So such a person who is acquainted to some extent with the esoteric doctrines, like a Kabbalist, he will not find the two statements conflicting, that the moon has no atmosphere and the moon has an atmosphere of its own. These two statements are not conflicting for him because the moon actually has no atmosphere which is similar to the atmosphere of the earth. Yet it is true that moon has an atmosphere of its own, and that is entirely different from what modern science calls atmosphere. Now, why this may be true? Understand that we have read about chains and rounds. Okay, so the life wave has already passed through the moon chain, and having completed that chain, all the life principles have been transferred to the earth chain. The moon is now a slowly dying planet. So it is not at all improbable that the moon still has some residual atmosphere of its own, which the Mahatma might be pointing to. He says that like the Westerns, we Easterns and occultists especially have our own way of expressing thought, as plain to us in their implied meaning as yours are to yourself. So all this confusion is simply due to the big cultural differences between the Mahatmas and Senate. And this was the reason which was causing all the misunderstandings. Mahatma Ji gives another example, just like the moon example he gave. He speaks of astronomy and the heliocentric system. He says that if at one time the previous slide here, example 2. So the example of astronomy and the heliocentric system. And he says that if at one time he said, how gloriously the sun is setting, see how rapidly it moves, how it rises and sets. And then if at another time he said, the fact that the sun is comparatively motionless and that it is but our earth that loses and then again catches sight of the sun in her diurnal motion, then again the student will accuse him of contradiction. Because once he is saying the sun is moving, it is setting, it is rising, and at another time he is saying the sun is motionless, it is the earth that moves. So this again will appear contradictory to somebody who is not aware of the heliocentric system. Okay. Such a person, he will accuse you of flatly contradicting yourself. Would this be a proof of your ignorance of the heliocentric system? And would you be accused with anything like justice of writing one thing today and denying it tomorrow? So Mahatma Ji is actually questioning Sinet's common sense. I mean, can this really be called conflicting statements just because you do not know the underlying occult philosophy? He says that writing my letters then as I do, a few lines now and a few words 2 hours later, having to catch up the thread of the same subject, perhaps with a dozen or more interruptions between the beginning and the end. I cannot promise you anything like Western accuracy, for ergo, the only victim of accident in this case is myself. So Mahatma Ji is explaining to Sinet the severe time constraints under which he continued instructing him, a novice European. The philosophy taught could never be wrong. Yet Mahatma Ji was like being martyred by these accusations. Okay. The innocent cross-examination to which I am subjected by you, and that I do not object to, and the positively predetermined purpose of catching me tripping whenever he can on Mr. Hume's part, a proceeding regarded as highly legal and honest in Western law, but to which we Asiatic savages object most emphatically, has given my colleagues and brothers a high opinion of my proclivities to martyrdom. That means inclination to kill your own self, inclination to get martyred. So Sinet was questioning the Mahatma due to his own ignorance. Okay, Sinet was ignorant of the doctrine, and that is the reason he had these doubts. But Hume, what was he doing? He was trying to catch the Mahatma committing an error. You know, there are some people who are just waiting to see where you trip, where you falter, where you make a mistake, and they want to catch you. So that is what Hume was trying to do. His doubts may not have been genuine. Yet the Mahatma was still going on instructing them. And this was very plain to all the other Chauhans and the adepts. So those adepts of the Brotherhood, they held a strong viewpoint that Mahatma KH was willfully getting himself killed. He was embracing martyrdom by the insults, the abuses, the kind of criticism which was being heaped upon him. In their sight, I have become a kind of Indo-Tibetan Simon Stylites, caught by the lower hook of the Simla interrogation mark and impaled on it. I see myself doomed to equilibrize upon the apex of the semicircle for fear of slipping down at every uncertain motion, either backward or forward. Such is the present condition of your humble friend. So he's explaining to Sinet in what situation the Mahatma Ji is finding himself. Now, this Simon Stylite, he was one of the 3 Greek Orthodox saints, a Greek saint. And these 3 saints, they were undergoing their own ascetic practices. So they lived on top of a pillar. Now, a pillar is so narrow, and the top of that pillar is going to be a very, very small space with no place for moving around. So the members of the Brotherhood, their view was that Mahatma KH had also willfully put himself in a similar position, as if on top of a pillar. But just instead of that, they are saying at the apex of a semicircle. So even if he makes a little motion, if his words are, explained a little bit here and there, it is like slipping down either side of that semicircle. But Mahatma Ji had willfully put himself there, and now he was trying to balance, trying to explain to them the correct doctrines. So many metaphors have been used here just to explain the position, the incorrect doubts and accusations, and what position the Mahatma was in. He says that ever since I undertook the extraordinary task of teaching 2 grown-up pupils with brains in which the methods of Western science had crystallized for years, one of whom is willing enough to make room for the new iconoclastic teaching, but who nevertheless requires a careful handling, while the other will receive nothing but on condition of grouping the subjects as he wants them to group, not in their natural order. I have been regarded by all our Chauhans as a lunatic. Now, if you read Madame Blavatsky's writings, she has described Mahatma KH as being a man of a very gentle and even character. These are the exact words she has used. Mahatma KH as being a man of a very gentle and even character, but of tremendously strong will, logical, easygoing, and taking endless pains to make his meaning clear. This is how Madame Blavatsky described Mahatma KH. And it is also evident from this letter that this was his nature. So much pains he was taking trying to explain Sinnett and Hume about their doubts. And so difficult was the task of teaching these novice Europeans, Sinnett and Hume, and such a mess of a situation had been created that the higher adepts, the Chauhans particularly, they were jocularly questioning Mahatma KH's sanity. Why does he still want to proceed? Okay. But the real point to ponder over here is this kind of situation which was created by Sinnett and Hume and even the other members who were raising their doubts. So the point to consider here is how good a student or a lay chela are we? We are receiving the teachings. Have we emptied our heads of our preconceived notions, of our biases? Are we receptive to the iconoclastic teachings? Iconoclastic is the ideas which will push out those long cherished ideas which we hold traditionally. But this is the tradition, so we stick to that idea. But when such new teachings, new iconoclastic ideas are given to us, are we ready to accept them? Are we receptive to them? Are we learning with an open mind? The golden stairs, the first step. Do we have an open mind? Are we exerting mentally to grasp the teachings, or are we waiting just to be spoon-fed? So these are the points of self-observation. When we sit down to study, reflect, and meditate, we should look at ourselves, how we are receiving these teachings. Then further, Mahatma KH mentions that I am seriously asked whether my early association with Western pellings had not made of me a half pelling and turned me also into a zing-zing visionary. All this had been expected. I do not complain. I narrate a fact and humbly demand credit for the same, only hoping it will not be mistaken again for a subtle and tricky way of getting out of a new difficulty. So pelling means the outer part of the continent. Okay, it is a Tibetan word, and in the current context, it means a foreigner, especially a Westerner. Now, Mahatma Kuthumi, he had traveled a good deal in Europe. This is also mentioned by Madame Blavatsky. And apparently, before being an adept, Mahatma KH, he had studied in some universities there in Europe. And then he also associated with the Western people. So his adept brothers were now asking him that had he also become half Western, because he was not giving up teaching Sinnett and Hume, and he was continuing despite all these crisis-like situation. So Mahatma KH, he takes all this in his humor, and he says that it was already anticipated. And he is narrating these facts to Sinnett only to dispel the mistaken ideas that Sinnett and Hume have regarding the conflicting teachings. And he is not trying to bypass them. Okay, he's not trying to trick his way to get out of a new difficulty. So with this, he answers the point number 4. And now point number 5, which Sinnett has raised. Most of those whom you may call, if you like, candidates for Devachan, die and are reborn in the Kamlok without remembrance. You can hardly call remembrance a dream of yours, some particular scene or scenes within whose narrow limits you would find enclosed a few persons, etc. Call it the personal remembrance of A.P. Sinnett if you can. So this was written on the notes on the back of Sinnett's to HPB, to the old lady. Now this is the 5th point of confusion which Sinnett had on his list. And Mahatmaji had written this statement, if you remember, in letter number 70C. This was chronological letter 70A and B. They were the doubts raised by Sinnett and Hume. And in letter 70C, they were answered. So in 70C, this is what Mahatmaji had written, and it is causing confusion to Sinnett and Hume. So what Mahatmaji is replying to this question, every just disembodied fourfold entity, whether it dies a natural or violent death from suicide or accident, mentally sane or insane, young or old, good, bad, or indifferent, loses at the instant of death all recollections. It is mentally annihilated. It sleeps its Akashic sleep in the Kamlok. Now, let us understand what Mahatmaji is trying to say here. First of all, in the doubt that has been raised, the term candidate for Devachan has been used. Candidate for Devachan means the person who has lived a reasonably good life, or at least he has sufficient good karma to ensure that he will enter the Devachanic state in the phases after physical death. So he is a candidate for Devachan, because there are also cases where they will have no Devachan if they do not have their sufficient good karma. Okay. So for such a candidate of Devachan, okay, he will surely have a Devachanic phase. Now at physical death, which means that just disembodied, the person is just disembodied, physical body is no longer there. At that time, the person becomes free of the lower 3 principles. Okay, the physical body, the etheric double, and the life principle. He is free of them. But the upper 4 principles, they persist. Okay, because separation of the higher and lower principles has not happened immediately. Okay, so upper 4 principles are existing, which means Atma, Buddhi, Manas plus Kam. All 4 are existing. That is why Mahatmaji is calling it the just disembodied fourfold entity. Now, what happens at the instant of death? Consciousness leaves the physical, the astral, and the mental bodies. So there are no memories, because mental body also is not conscious. So it is termed as mental annihilation. Okay, and so where is the consciousness if it is not in the physical, astral, and mental? It is beyond that. It is in the Akashic plane. And therefore, the Kamlok, in that plane, the entity is dormant, because there is no consciousness at the astral level. So in Kamlok, the entity is dormant, it is sleeping. This is called the Akashic sleep, because consciousness inheres at the Akashic level. Now, this is a very good hint if you really contemplate about these states after death. The states in sleep, they are the same as the states in death. The only difference is that the absence of physical body. At the time of death, absence of physical body, but in sleep, you're going to wake up and come back in your physical body. So if we want to really understand the states of death, we must contemplate and try to understand the states of sleep. Okay. Then Mahatma Ji says that this state, that means the mental annihilation, okay, this state lasts from a few hours, rarely less days, weeks, months, sometimes to several years. That state of akashic sleep, it will last. All this according to the entity, to his mental status at the moment of death, to the character of his death, etc. Okay. Now, what? Okay. Recall what we do in our Hindu tradition. When a person is nearing his end, he is asked to chant some holy word, Ram or Om. If he is not able to chant, someone will sit near him. They will chant the holy scriptures so that the dying person, mentally, he goes to a higher plane. Okay. The after death state, it is determined by the mental status at the moment of dying. That is why people try to raise his mental status. Now, if you come back, if you consider sleep again, suppose a person had a very difficult day and he was worrying, and then he tries to go to sleep. He's worrying, he's having angry thoughts, and he goes to sleep. Do you think he will sleep peacefully? No, because his consciousness will remain entangled in the astral and mental levels. Okay, in his sleep also, he will keep having those thoughts, whatever happened during the day. They might be dreams or they might be nightmare, because his last thoughts before going to sleep were as such. So death is also exactly like that. What is the last thought before the person dies? Okay. Now, instead of this, if the person who's falling asleep, consider a sleep example, if he has a calm mind, if he meditates for a while, or if he reads some good literature before he goes to sleep, then probably he will have a very peaceful sleep, because his last thoughts before going to sleep were peaceful. So the consciousness is no longer entangled in the mental or astral level. It goes into, where does it go? It goes into dreamless sleep. There are no dreams. So it goes into sushupti. Okay. Here in the state of death, what it is called? Akashic sleep. Okay. It is not in the mental or astral level. So we see that actually much spiritual learning can happen there. Sleep and death are very much alike. And by understanding the after death stages, we can learn to make our sleep time very useful for us in terms of spiritual evolution. Okay? So Mahatma Ji says that the state after death, it depends on the mental status at the moment of death, and also upon the character of death, meaning whether it was a natural death or whether it was an accident or whether it was suicide. And then he further adds that remembrance will return slowly and gradually towards the end of the gestation to the entity or ego, still more slowly but far more imperfectly and incompletely to the shell, and fully to the ego at the moment of its entrance into Devachan. Now, because there is no mental consciousness, so there is no memory. Entity is in Akashic sleep. Okay, it is like the Sushupti of our sleep state. Then at the end of gestation period, so after the sleep time is over, slowly the memory returns, meaning that these principles, they will gradually awaken from sleep. They will gain consciousness again. So this is just like when we awake from sleep. Okay, but now in the state of death, the principles are awakening minus the physical body. Okay, in state of sleep, the awakening happens and consciousness comes to physical body. Okay, so the lower principles, excuse me, just a moment. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so at the end of the gestation period, slowly the memory will return and consciousness will return to the principles. The lower principles and the higher principles, now they will separate. Okay, so this will result in Kamrup. The lower principle, it forms the shell or the Kamrup. And the ego, it will gradually go into the Devachanic state. Okay, then memory, it will be imperfect and incomplete for the shell, that is for the Kamrup. But the ego will regain the full memory. So what we have seen in sleep consciousness, the memory returns to physical body and person awakes. But in case of death, it is the ego which awakes. Okay, there is no physical body, so it is the ego which will awake and it will go into Devachan. And now the latter, meaning the ego, being a state determined and brought by its past life, the ego does not fall headlong, but sinks into it gradually, meaning sinks into Devachan gradually and by easy stages. So Devachan is not an instant change of state for the ego, that it awakens and goes into Devachan. No, it goes slowly, gradually. Okay, from gestation, it's a gradual process. With the first dawn of that state, meaning the rising of Devachanic state, appears that life, or rather is once more lived over by the ego from its first day of consciousness to its last, from the most important down to the most trifling event. All are marshaled before the spiritual eye of the ego. It means that the lifetime which just got completed, that entire lifetime in all its details, it flashes before the ego in its entirety. Only, unlike the events of real life, those of them remain only that are chosen by the new liver. New liver is the ego. Okay, it is not the organ in our abdominal cavity. Liver here is pertaining to the ego. That humor Mahatma Ji is using. Pardon the word. Clinging to certain scenes and actors, these remain permanently, while all the others fade away to disappear forever or to return to their creator, the shell. That is the astral entity. Okay? The ego regains consciousness. It wakes up from the Akashic sleep and it slowly sinks into Devachanic state. This is also called the second birth. And at this time, the ego lives again with selected happy memories that were there in the life that just got closed. Now, what happens to the unhappy memories or the memories which were full of passion and desire? If the force was strong enough in such memories or passions, then they will persist. They will remain with the shell as tendencies of the Kamrup. Okay, and the rest of them, they just fade out as their force dissipates. So Mahatma Ji tells Sinet, now try to understand this highly important because so highly just and retributive law in its effect. What is the highly just and retributive law? It is the law of karma, because based on that, now all these states are getting decided. Out of the resurrected past is the life which the ego remembered, okay, the life which just got closed. So out of that resurrected past, nothing remains but what the ego has felt spiritually, that was evolved by and through and lived over by his spiritual faculties, they be love or hatred. Now, this is a very revealing point. In fact, even I thought that when we speak of spiritual, it is only about virtue and good things and noble things and love. Okay, but very clearly Mahatma Ji is telling that it can be love or hatred. Now, how this can be? We know that our buddhi is our spiritual soul. Okay, so Atma Buddhi are the spiritual faculties. Now, when we say that what the ego has felt spiritually, it means the ability to perceive by the spiritual faculty, that is Atma Buddhi. If anything has been perceived by Atma Buddhi, that means the ego has felt it spiritually. Any perception that will originate by, through, or in these spiritual faculties, that is Atma Buddhi, then whether that perception is of love or it is of hate, that is felt by the ego spiritually. Okay, because it has its origin or its source in the spiritual soul. Now, we all know that love can be felt spiritually, and this is the point to note here, that even hate can be felt spiritually, because love and hate are polar opposites. In fact, further in the letter, Mahatma Ji has explained, it's not clear-cut black and white, love and hate. There are many shades of love. In many ways, love is felt, and there are many shades of hate. In many ways, hate is felt. So that is what, if anything, has its source in the higher principles, then it will be felt by the ego spiritually. He says, all that I am now trying to describe is in truth indescribable. As no two men, not even two photographs of the same person, nor yet two leaves resemble line for line each other, so no two states in Devachan are like, unless he be an adept who can realize such a state in his periodical Devachan. How can one be expected to form a correct picture of the same? So he's trying to explain that Devachanic state, you cannot comprehend it like that. It's not, like one thing fits all. It's not like that. Just like no two people have the same fingerprint, so also no two persons will have the same Devachanic state. It is a subjective state, a mental state. Moreover, even for the same ego, when the ego will keep reincarnating after every incarnation, when the personality dies, the ego will go into Devachan. So for the same ego also, this repeated Devachanic state will not be the same. No two states for the same ego will be the same, unless it is the ego of an adept. Okay. So something which is always changing, not only for different persons, but also for the same entity in every reincarnation cycle. It is very difficult to get an accurate idea of that state. Now, the next point of doubt or conflict on Sennett's list was, certainly the new ego, once that is reborn in the Devachan, retains for a certain time, proportionate to its earth life, a complete recollection of his spiritual life on earth. This was written by the Mahatma in the long Devachanic letter. Now, Mahatma K.H. says that therefore there is no contradiction in saying that the ego, once reborn in the Devachan, retains for a certain time, proportionate to its earth life, a complete recollection of his spiritual life on earth. Here again, the omission of the word spiritual alone produced a misunderstanding. So in the original letter, the word spiritual was missing, and it was later on inserted by the Mahatma, that it is the recollection of his spiritual life on earth, because in the Devachanic state, you have only the spiritual faculties. So only the perception, the spiritual perceptions, only they can be retained or recollected, and they will be proportionate to the time duration on earth. Okay. So he says that there is no contradiction in this point. Why Sennett or Hume are perceiving it, Mahatma Ji doesn't answer to that. Then he goes to the next point, where Sennett mentioned all those who have not slipped down into the mire of unredeemable sin and bestiality go to Devachan. What is the point of confusion? Mahatma K.H. says, all those that do not slip down into the 8th sphere go to Devachan. Where is the point made or contradiction? Okay, we'll just go through again. What is this 8th sphere? Now, unredeemable sin and bestiality and slipping into the 8th sphere, it means that there was nothing good or noble or virtuous or spiritual in the life of the person. And so there was nothing of the higher mind which could be assimilated to buddhi. Probably the link between the higher principles and the lower quaternary, it gets broken even during the life of the person. He is so overcome with selfishness and desire and passion that no light of the buddhi can flow to the personality or guide the personality. Okay. So the mind is totally consumed by this sin and bestiality and the It breaks the link between spiritual soul and lower quaternary. The Kamrup of such an entity, that means after the death of the person, when that shell is formed, the Kamrup, it is such an entity, it is not a shell, but it is a fully conscious entity. Okay, shell means what? That the higher manas has been assimilated with buddhi. But in this case, there is no higher manas because there was nothing noble. So nothing got assimilated to buddhi. The entire manas was consumed by Kam. It was assimilated to the lower quaternary. So that entity, it is fully conscious. Okay, and there is no devachan for him. So what will be the state of such an entity? That is what is avichi, or the eighth sphere. Okay, it experiences the most miserable state, and this devachanic state, which is the state of bliss, and the state of avichi, that is the state of such a person who has slipped into the eighth sphere, they are polar opposites. Both are mental states, okay, but they are polar opposites. So in this point of Synod, there was actually no conflict. Okay. Then we come to the 8th point. So I will complete the 8th point today, and then probably we can take up questions if there are any after the Hindi translation. So in the 8th point, Synod raises the doubt. It, meaning Devachan, is an ideal paradise in each case of the ego's own making, and by him filled with the scenery, crowded with the incidents, and thronged with the people he would expect to find in such a sphere of compensative bliss. So this was the doubt, how the ego is creating its own ideal Devachan. Mahatma Khet says, the Devachan state, I repeat, can be as little described or explained by giving a however minute and graphic description of the state of an ego taken at random, as all the human lives collectively could be described by the life of Napoleon or that of any other. So he is clarifying that Devachanic state cannot be generalized. Just as the life of all human beings, they cannot be symbolized by describing the life of any one man. Let us say Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the great French military commander, and he was a political leader. Okay. Now there are so many parameters which determine what kind of a life a person lives. The life which Napoleon lived, that doesn't apply to what any other person is living. Okay, these parameters are different for different people. So how can you generalize? If you cannot generalize the life of a person, obviously you cannot generalize Devachan for every person, because Devachan is nothing. It is a consequence of how the life was lived. Mahatma Khet further explains that there are millions of various states of happiness and misery. Emotional states having their source in the physical as well as the spiritual faculties and senses, and only the latter surviving. So our emotional states are literally uncountable. Emotions, they not only arise from our physical faculties, like the 5 physical senses, but also from our spiritual faculties and senses. Okay, so they have their source in the 6th principle, the Buddhic principle. These are the spiritual emotions because they have their source in the spiritual faculty, 6th principle. So such spiritual emotions, they will persist in the Devachanic state. Mahatma Ji mentions that an honest laborer will feel differently from an honest millionaire. Now, you see why? Because the parameters of both their life is different. How a laborer will live his life and how a millionaire will live. So they will feel differently. They will have different states. Then Miss Nightingale's state will differ considerably from that of a young bride who dies before the consummation of what she regards as happiness. Nightingale here refers to Florence Nightingale. She was the English nurse who is considered the founder of modern nursing, and she had cared for thousands of wounded soldiers during the war between Great Britain and Russia. Okay, so her happiness was in caring for the wounded soldiers. And this is different from the happiness that a new bride will feel. Her idea of happiness is different. And Florence Nightingale, her idea of happiness was caring for humanity. Now, the two farmer love their families. That means the laborer and the millionaire. They love the families. Still, their love is different. The philanthropist, that means the nurse, Florence Nightingale, she loves humanity. And the girl, who's the young bride, she centers the whole world in her future husband. So her definition of love is again different. The melomaniac is a person who is an ardent lover of music. He knows no higher state of bliss and happiness than music, the most divine and spiritual of arts. So what Mahatma Ji is trying to say here is that happiness is one emotion, but different people experience it differently. The laborer, the millionaire, the nurse, the bride, a music lover, for each of them, this notion of love, the state of love, is experienced differently. The Devachan merges from its highest into its lowest degree by insensible gradations. What insensible gradation means? Imperceptible gradations. Okay, there is no clear demarcation between one stage and the next stage. While from the last step of Devachan, that means from the lowermost stage of Devachan, the ego will often find itself in avicca's faintest state, which towards the end of the spiritual selection of events may become a bona fide avicca. Avicca and avicci are same. Okay? Devachan and avicci, we said they are both mental states and they are polar opposites. Okay, so towards the lower end of Devachanic states, the bliss will slowly start becoming less and less, decreasing. And finally, the state where there is no longer any bliss, because there is no longer any spiritual event to result in that Devachanic bliss. So from that state or from that level onwards, this real states of misery will start manifesting. That is the state of avicci. So it's like a graded scale. From bliss, slowly it is moving towards misery. And he says, remember, every feeling is relative. There is neither good nor evil, happiness nor misery per se. Just take a moment to let this sink in. Every feeling is relative. There is neither good nor evil, neither happiness nor misery. Okay. When, again, consider that example of the rich man, the millionaire. Suppose if he is given 100 rupees, 100 rupees means nothing for him. He doesn't feel happy about it. Okay. But consider the poor laborer. If he is given 100 rupees, that is a lot for him. So he will be happy. So see the feeling, it is relative. The laborer is happy with 100 rupees, whereas the millionaire is not. Okay. Likewise, even good and evil, they are all relative. We feel so strongly about our emotions, but understand what Mahatma Ji is saying. There is neither good nor evil, neither happiness nor misery per se. So with this, I will stop for today's session, and I will request Sister Meenakshi Ji to give us the translation in Hindi.
Namaste. Thank you, sister. आज हम लेटर नंबर 85A और 85B ले रहे हैं। 85A में कथित विरोधाभासों पर सीनेट द्वारा बनाई गई सूची है और 85B में उस पर मास्टर के एच के उत्तर है। 85A में से एपी सीनेट का यह मुद्दा है कि कहते हैं कि मुझे आशा है कि कथित विरोधाभासों के संबंध में श्रम पूर्वक मेरी इच्छा के विरुद्ध प्रयास करने में मेरे आज्ञा पालन के लिए आप मुझे बहुत श्रेय देंगे। जैसे कि मैंने कहा है कि मुझे लगता है कि यह चिंता करने योग्य नहीं है। हालांकि फिलहाल वे मुझे देवाचन और दुर्घटना के पीड़ितों के बारे में मेरे विचारों को स्पष्ट करते हैं। ऐसा इसलिए है क्योंकि वे मुझे परेशान नहीं करते हैं कि मैंने अब तक मुझे नोट्स बनाने चाहिए ऐसे आपके सुझाव पर अभी तक काम नहीं किया है। मास्टर के एच कहते हैं कि न ही वे मुझे विशेषकर परेशान करते हैं लेकिन चूंकि वे हमारे आपसी मित्र को हमारे खिलाफ एक अच्छी पकड़ प्रदान करते हैं, जिसे वह किसी भी दिन उस ओछे तरीके से उपयोग करने की संभावना रखता है। आपकी अनुमति से उन्हें एक बार फिर मैं आपको समझाता हूँ। सीनेट का अगला मुद्दा है, वे कहते हैं कि मनुष्य के विकास से संबंधित कुछ पत्रों में ह्यूम विसंगतियां ढूंढने के इच्छुक है, लेकिन उनके साथ बातचीत करते समय मैंने हमेशा यह दावा किया कि इसमें कोई विसंगतियां नहीं है, केवल राउंड्स एंड रेसेस की परिभाषा के कारण संभ्रम है। फिर उसने यह सोचने का साहस किया कि जैसे जैसे आप जानकारी देते हैं, आप तत्व ज्ञान की निर्मिति करते गए और पहले कल्पना की गई रेसेस की तुलना में और अधिक रेसेस की कल्पना करते रहे। उसके इस अनुमान को मैंने निरर्थक समझा। मास्टर केज कहते हैं कि बिल्कुल यह कठिनाइयों में से बाहर निकलने का हमारा बिल्कुल ही सर्वसामान्य तरीका है। स्वयं का आविष्कार करने के बाद हम काल्पनिक रेसेस का आविष्कार करके आविष्कारकों की चुकौती करते हैं। ऐसी बहुत सी बातें हैं जिनका आविष्कार करने का हम पर आरोप लगाया जाता है। इससे पहले कि हम आगे बढ़े, मेरी विनती है कि आप लेटर नंबर 85B में जो सिद्धत्व से जुड़े तथ्य दिए हैं उसे पढ़ें। अब समय आ गया है कि आप हमें वैसे ही जाने जैसे कि हम जानते हैं, उसे नहीं, लेकिन केवल आपको यह सिद्ध करने के लिए कि हमने उन रेसेस का आविष्कार नहीं किया है, मैं आपके हित के लिए वह सब कहूंगा जो पहले कभी नहीं दिया गया है। मैं आपको बौद्ध धर्म या यूं कहे तो लामाइज्म पर रिस डेविड्स के कार्य का संपूर्ण चैप्टर समझाऊंगा। चूंकि वे ओरिएंटलिस्ट सज्जन दुनिया को हमारे पवित्र धर्म ग्रंथों पर अपने कथित अनुवाद और टिप्पणियां देने का साहस करते हैं, थियोसोफिस्टों को जनता को उचित सिद्धांत और स्पष्टीकरण देकर उन बुद्धिजीवियों की प्रचंड अज्ञानता को दिखाने दे जिसे वे बेतुके काल्पनिक सिद्धांत मानते हैं। आगे एपीएस का मुद्दा है, मैं सहज ही समझ सकता हूँ कि हम पर विरोधाभासों और विसंगतियों का आरोप लगाया जाता है, यहाँ तक कि आज एक बात लिखने और अगले दिन उसे नकारने के लिए भी। क्या आप यह जान सकते हैं कि मैं अपने पत्र कैसे लिखता हूँ और उन्हें मैं कितना समय दे पाता हूँ? तब कदाचित आप आग्रही न होकर कम आलोचक होते। इस मुद्दे पर मास्टर कहते हैं कि चूंकि मैं मामूली से विसंगति को स्वीकारता हूँ और यहाँ तक कि केवल उनके लिए जो आपके जैसे ही हमारे सिद्धांतों से पूर्णतः अपरिचित है, क्या इस कारण उन सिद्धांतों को सच में विरोधाभासी माना जाना चाहिए? मान लीजिए कि मैंने पिछले पत्र में लिखा था, चंद्रमा पर कोई वायुमंडल नहीं है और चंद्रमा का अपना वातावरण है। एक कब्बालिस्ट जो जानता है कि चंद्रमा का किसी भी तरह से हमारी पृथ्वी के बराबर कोई वायुमंडल नहीं है, लेकिन उसका अपना वातावरण है जो कि आपके वैज्ञानिकों द्वारा कहे जाने वाले वातावरण से बिल्कुल ही भिन्न है। वे कब्बालिस्ट यह भी जानते हैं कि पाश्चिमात्यों की तरह हम पौर्वात्यों और विशेष रूप से सिद्ध योगियों के पास विचार व्यक्त करने के अपने अपने तरीके हैं, जो उनमें अंतर्निहित अर्थों में हमारे लिए उतने ही स्पष्ट है जितने आपके विचार आपके लिए है। दूसरा उदाहरण मास्टर देते हैं कि वे कहते हैं कि दूसरे उदाहरण के लिए यह सोचे कि आप अपने शिष्यों को खगोल शास्त्र सिखाएंगे। आज उसे बताए कि देखो सूरज कितने अप्रतिम रूप से ढल रहा है, देखो यह कितनी तेजी से जा रहा है, कैसे उदय होता है, कैसे अस्त होता है आदि। और कल उसे इस तथ्य से अवगत करने का प्रयास करे कि सूर्य तुलनात्मक रूप से गतिहीन है और यह केवल हमारी पृथ्वी है जो अपने प्रतिदिन की गति में सूर्य का दर्शन नहीं कर पाती और फिर से दर्शन करती है, और 10 में से आपके एक शिष्य आप पर स्वयं का खंडन करने के लिए आप पर आरोप लगाएंगे। क्या यह सूर्य केंद्रित प्रणाली के बारे में आपकी अज्ञानता का प्रमाण होगा? और क्या आप पर आज एक बात लिखने और कल उसे नकारने पर कोई भी आरोप लगाया जा सकता है? मैं अपने पत्र जिस तरह से लिखता हूँ, जैसे अभी कुछ पंक्तियां लिखी और 2 घंटे बाद कुछ शब्द लिखे, एक ही विषय के सूत्र को शुरू से अंत तक दर्जनों रुकावटों के साथ धरे रखना, मैं आपसे पाश्चिमात्य सटीकता जैसा कुछ भी वादा नहीं कर सकता। इसीलिए इस मामले में एकमात्र दुर्घटना का शिकार मैं ही हूँ। आपके द्वारा मुझसे की गई पूछताछ, जिस पर मुझे कोई आपत्ति नहीं है, और मिस्टर ह्यूम की ओर से जब भी संभव हो मुझे भूल करते हुए पकड़ने के दृढ़तापूर्वक पूर्व निर्धारित उद्देश्य, एक ऐसी कृति जिसे पाश्चिमात्य नियम में बहुत ही वैध और उचित माना जाता है, लेकिन जिस पर हम एशियाई बाशिंदे बहुत अधिक आपत्ति जताते हैं, जिस कारण मेरे साथी संगी और बंधुगणों ने शहादत के प्रति मेरी प्रवृत्ति के बारे में अपनी राय बनाई है। उनकी नजर में मैं एक इंडो टिबेटन साइमन स्टाइलाइट्स बन गया हूँ। शिमला पूछताछ चिन्ह के निचले हुक द्वारा पकड़ा गया और उस पर चढ़ाया गया। मैं पीछे या आगे की हर अनिश्चित गति पर फिसलने के डर से अर्धवृत्त के शीर्ष पर संतुलन बनाने के लिए ही खुद को पाता हूँ। आपके विनीत मित्र की ऐसी स्थिति है। जब से मैंने 2 वयस्क शिष्यों को सिखाने का असाधारण कार्य किया है, जिनके मस्तिष्क में वर्षों से पश्चिमी विज्ञान के तरीके स्थापित थे, जिनमें से एक अभूतपूर्व शिक्षण के लिए अपने मस्तिष्क में जगह बनाने के लिए काफी इच्छुक है, लेकिन फिर भी उसे सावधान पूर्वक संभालने की आवश्यकता है, जबकि दूसरे को कुछ भी नहीं मिलेगा जिसकी यह शर्त है कि विषयों को उनके स्वाभाविक क्रम से नहीं बल्कि उनकी सामूहिकरण करना, जैसा कि वह उन्हें समूहित करना चाहता है। मुझे हमारे सभी चौहानों ने एक बावले के रूप में माना है। मुझे गंभीरता से पूछा जाता है कि कहीं पाश्चिमात्य विदेशियों के साथ शुरुआती दौर के संपर्क ने मुझे आधा विदेशी तो नहीं बना दिया और मुझे कल्पनामयी में भी बदल दिया। यह सब अपेक्षित था। मैं शिकायत नहीं करता, मैं तथ्य बताता हूँ और विनम्रता पूर्वक इसके श्रेय की मांग करता हूँ। केवल यह आशा करता हूँ कि उसे एक कठिनाई से बाहर निकलने के लिए चतुरता और चालाकी का तरीका समझने की गलती नहीं की जाएगी। सीनेट का अगला मुद्दा है, उनमें से अधिकांश को, जिन्हें आप चाहे तो देवाचन के कैंडिडेट्स कह सकते हैं, वे मर जाते हैं और बिना स्मृति या स्मरण के कामलोक में पुनः जन्मते हैं। स्मृति को आप शायद ही अपना सपना कहेंगे। कुछ विशेष दृश्य के लिए दृश्य या दृश्यों के सीमित क्षेत्रों के भीतर आप कुछ व्यक्तियों को पाएंगे। आप चाहे तो इसे एपिसिनेट की स्मृति कह सकते हैं। इस मुद्दे पर मास्टर कहते हैं, प्रत्येक विदेही 4 तत्वों वाले जीव, चाहे उसकी मृत्यु नैसर्गिक हो या पीड़ादायक हो, आत्महत्या से हो या दुर्घटना से, चाहे वह मानसिक रूप से स्वस्थ हो या अस्वस्थ हो, चाहे युवा हो या वृद्ध, अच्छा बुरा या उदासीन हो, मृत्यु के तुरंत बाद सभी स्मृति खो देता है। वह स्मृतिहीन होता है, वह मानसिक रूप से मिट जाता है, वह कामलोक में अपनी आकाशिक नींद लेता है। यह अवस्था कुछ घंटों तक, दिनों तक, हफ्तों, महीनों, कभी कभी कई वर्षों तक बनी रहती है। यह सब उस जीव के मृत्यु के समय उसकी मानसिक स्थिति, मृत्यु की दशा आदि के अनुसार होती है। वह स्मृति धीरे धीरे और क्रमशः एक जीव को जेस्टेशन के अंत में लौटेगी। एक शेल को और भी धीरे धीरे लेकिन अपूर्ण और अधूरे रूप से, और एक जीवात्मा को देवाचन में उसके प्रवेश के क्षण पूर्णतः लौट आएगी। और देवाचन यह वह स्थिति है जो उसने अपने पिछले जीवन द्वारा लाई गई और निर्धारित की गई अवस्था है। जीवात्मा तेजी से उसमें नहीं जाता है, बल्कि आहिस्ता आहिस्ता सहज रूप से निमग्न होता है। उस अवस्था के आरंभ से ही उसके प्रथम दिन से लेकर आखिरी दिन तक की चेतना तक का जीवन प्रकट होता है। या यूं कहे कि एक बार फिर जीवात्मा द्वारा जिया जाता है। सबसे महत्वपूर्ण से लेकर सबसे तुच्छ घटना तक सभी घटनाएं जीवात्मा की अंतर्दृष्टि के सामने क्रमबद्ध रूप से आती है। भौतिक जीवन की घटनाओं के विपरीत केवल वे ही घटनाएं रह जाती है जिन्हें नया जीवन देवाचन में नया जीवन जीने वाला चुनता है, जो विशिष्ट स्थान, दृश्य और व्यक्तियों से लिप्त रहता है। यही स्थायी रूप से बने रहते हैं, जबकि अन्य सभी सदा के लिए लोप हो जाते हैं या अपने रचनाकार शेल के पास लौट जाते हैं। अब इस अत्यंत महत्वपूर्ण बात को समझने का प्रयास करें, क्योंकि यह अपने परिणामों में अत्यंत न्यायसंगत नियम है। पुनर्जीवित अतीत काल में से केवल वही बचा रहता है जिसे जीवात्मा ने आंतरिक रूप से महसूस किया हो, जो उसकी आंतरिक क्षमताओं द्वारा विकसित जीवित रहे थे। वे प्रेम या नफरत हो सकते हैं। मैं जो कुछ भी वर्णन करने का प्रयास कर रहा हूँ, उसका असल में वर्णन नहीं किया जा सकता है। जैसे कोई भी दो मनुष्य या एक ही व्यक्ति की दो तस्वीरें, यहाँ तक कि दो पत्तियां एक दूसरे के साथ आकार में मिलती जुलती नहीं है, उसी प्रकार देवाचन की कोई भी दो अवस्थाएं एक जैसी नहीं है। जब तक कि वह एक सिद्ध पुरुष न हो जो अपने नियतकालिक देवाचन में ऐसी स्थिति का एहसास कर सकता है, किसी से इसका सही चित्रण करने की उम्मीद कैसे की जा सकती है। एपी सीनेट का अगला मुद्दा है, देवाचन के ऊपर लिखित लंबे पत्र में से निश्चित रूप से नया जीवात्मा जो एक बार देवाचन में पुनः जन्मता है, वह अपने पृथ्वी जीवन के अनुपात में कुछ समय के लिए पृथ्वी पर अपने जीवन की पूरी स्मृति बनाए रखता है। इस पर मास्टर कहते हैं, इसलिए यह कहने में कोई विरोधाभास नहीं है कि जीवात्मा जब एक बार देवाचन में पुनः जन्मता है, वह अपने पृथ्वी जीवन के अनुपात में कुछ निश्चित समय के लिए पृथ्वी पर अपने स्पिरिचुअल जीवन की पूरी स्मृति को बनाए रखता है। यहाँ भी स्पिरिचुअल शब्द के छूट जाने से गलतफहमी हुई थी। एपी सीनेट का अगला मुद्दा है, वे सभी जो अत्यधिक पाप और पाशविकता के दलदल में नहीं गिरे हैं, वे देवाचन जाते हैं। इस पर मास्टर कहते हैं, वे सभी जो 8 स्फीयर में नहीं फिसलते, वे देवाचन जाते हैं। इसमें विरोधाभास कहाँ है। एपी सीनेट का अगला मुद्दा है, प्रत्येक में देवाचन यह जीवात्मा ने स्वयं निर्मित आदर्शपूर्ण स्वर्ग है, और जो उसके द्वारा घटनाओं के सहित प्राकृतिक दृश्यों से व्याप्त और प्रतिफल रूपी परमानंद के ऐसे क्षेत्र में वह जिन्हें देखना चाहता है, उन लोगों से भरा हुआ है। इस पर मास्टर कहते हैं, मैं दोहराता हूँ कि देवाचन स्थिति को किसी भी जीव की स्थिति का एक बहुत ही छोटा सा ग्राफिक विवरण देकर उतना ही कम वर्णित किया जा सकता है या समझाया जा सकता है, जितना कि सभी मनुष्यों को सामूहिक रूप से नेपोलियन के जीवन या किसी अन्य व्यक्ति के रूप में वर्णित किया जा सकता है। सुख और दुख की लाखों विभिन्न अवस्थाएं हैं। भावनात्मक अवस्थाओं का स्रोत शारीरिक और साथ ही आंतरिक क्षमताओं और शक्तियों और समझ में होता है, और केवल बाद वाला ही यानी स्पिरिचुअल कायम रहता है। एक ईमानदार मजदूर की भावना एक करोड़पति से भिन्न होगी। मिस फ्लोरेंस नाइटिंगेल की स्थिति एक युवा वधू की स्थिति से काफी भिन्न होगी, जो जिससे वह खुशी मानती है उसकी पूर्ति से पहले ही मर जाती है। वे दोनों अपने परिवारों से प्यार करती है। जो परोपकारी है, समाज सेवी है, उसका प्रेम मानवता के प्रति है। युवती का संपूर्ण संसार उसके भावी पति में केंद्रित है। संगीतज्ञ संगीत से बढ़कर आनंद और खुशी की कोई उच्च अवस्था नहीं जानता, जो कलाओं में सबसे दिव्य और उच्चतम कला है। असंवेदनशील अनुक्रमों द्वारा देवाचन अपने उच्चतम से निम्नतम स्तर में विलीन हो जाता है, जबकि देवाचन के अंतिम चरण से जीवात्मा अक्सर स्वयं को अविच्छि की अस्पष्ट सी स्थिति में पाएगा, जो घटनाओं के आध्यात्मिक चयन के अंत में एक असली अविच्छि बन जाता है। याद रखें, प्रत्येक भावना सापेक्ष होती है। न तो अच्छाई होती है, न बुराई, न खुशी और न ही दुख। थैंक यू। नमस्ते।
Thank you, Meenakshi ji, for this very apt interpretation in Hindi. And if anybody has anything to add or a question regarding what we have covered today, you may please unmute and speak. We are currently on the point number 8. Point 8 we have covered half, and there are 12 points which have been raised by Senate. So the remaining points we will cover in our next session. I received a query from Brother Sharma ji from Ujjain. It is regarding letter 41. Okay, so I will take that offline because it is of a previous letter. I will answer your query offline. Any questions pertaining to today's part that we have covered? Then we better think of what the Mahatma Ji says. All feelings are relative. Okay. And the states of death versus the states of sleep. Let this be in our mind, in our contemplation. And with this, we will bring today's session to close. Is there anything you would like to add, Brother Pradeep ji?
No, that the state of position relating to death as well as sleep.
Yes.
Mahatma explained very beautifully. And also another point, the spiritual journey as well as the other side of that spirituality. That also is explained. It is new thing, we must think over it. That you have pointed out beautifully. And one thing, what is Jing visionary? I have not checked it. Half spellings, but it is mentioned that Jing, it is Tibetan words, I think.
I thought that they are just, he's trying to compare himself to the Western people because of his previous association with them. So just like the Western people and the kind of vision that the modern science has, that kind of an outlook or a vision those people have. So perhaps he's just trying to say that because of Mahatma Ji's previous association, he is also having that kind of a vision and he's trying to transform the European chelas, lay chelas. That was my understanding. I don't know if Jing actually means something in Tibetan.
I don't know exactly. Second, that you have mentioned that fourfold entity means Atma, Buddhi, and or what are that fourfold? Kindly repeat that again.
Okay, so Mahatma Ji mentioned that a person who is just disembodied, just his physical death has happened. So the lower three principles are no longer there. Physical body, astral double, and pran. They are not there. So what is remaining? The upper four.
Okay.
That is calm is still remaining. So that is why it is fourfold entity, which goes
Yes.
into a akashic sleep.
Right. They have actually some spiritual organization. I will not mention their names. They have developed some kind of a video. It was forwarded to me, my close relative, who is, I don't know whether he is still now or not. Actually, husband expired because of accident. And wife is in a deep sleep. So wife marking husband after death, he is coming and opening the door, etc., etc. But the way he is opening that time, it is just imagination. That organization doing it in that manner, up to that level. Up to means they can describe this astral point and lower mental world level. That was. So that is another. Here I am just thinking of that video which they are circulating. Even now also they are circulating. Death and sleep and death after death, how people are moving in Bhuva locus. They are also mentioning.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you.
So one point to note here is that a person who has lived a reasonably good life without,
Yes, yes.
having, so that person after death will be in that akashic sleep.
Yes.
But the state differs for different people, because what was the thought at the time of death and what were the circumstances of death? So maybe another person doesn't enter the akashic sleep. He's still awake. In that fourfold entity is still awake. It may be possible. Here we have seen only candidates for Devachan. So what you mentioned about that video which is circulating, probably it could be a different case.
Yes. Different method, Mahatma already mentioned, different methods have different methods adopted by different spiritual persons.
Yes.
To attract the students. So it will go on like this. Okay. So
Right.
we will now close it.
Right. Thank you, sir. And thank you all for participating. We'll bring the session to a close with our closing prayer. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Sarvesham Swastirabhavatu Sarvesham Shantirabhavatu Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu Lokah Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina Sarve Santu Niramaya Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschit Dukhabhag Bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Namaste and thank you.
Thank you, Viraj.
Lord, peace, harmony, and oneness to all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.